The term science is a very devastatingly effective marketing branding term, whether it's intended that way or not. If I send every piece of information about myself to 10 different PhDs or evidence based guys, what am I going to get back? I'm going to get back 10 completely disparate programs.
Welcome to the N1 Experience, brought to you by N1 Education, the leader in fitness education.
All right, Alex. So we're rolling off of kind of a hot topic revolving a video that you make. And I believe you've actually touched on this topic about 2 years ago in a very, I would say, very similar video. I kind of watched them both. Like a lot of the same points, I think, were brought up on those. So could you just give us the cliff notes for anybody that hasn't been following? Like, how did we get to this discussion of criticizing exercise science and kind of where it fits in? And, maybe then we can get into what your reaction is to the feedback and conversations that you've had after that post.
Yeah, sure thing. I had made the video. So I remember the one I made the first time around, and it was after kind of tracking who some of the bigger names on YouTube and social media were and kind of how they were positioning their content. Because I have my own experience and I have the experience of the people that I look up to and follow and learn from. And this whole discipline of strength training for whatever purpose, whether it's size, strength, or athletic development, it's been growing for a long time. And there's a lot of know-how that's come out of that. So watching this branch of exercise science kind of develop over the years and watching people who either come out of that realm with the education, with the degree, and position themselves to consumers to try to sell to them based on their degree, or watching other people kind of find that niche where they're doing the science explained thing, where everything is going over, a dozen different studies to try to find some bit you can sink your teeth into, something to inform your training, give you an edge, and again, appeal to the consumer off those grounds. I was seeing that more and more, and it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Not necessarily because there's anything wrong with evaluating the literature or trying to get to the bottom of this stuff from an academic perspective, but because I feel like the way it gets engaged with leads people down a wrong path. It leads them to incorrect conclusions. It leads them to misuse certain terms or conceptualize problems incorrectly. And especially, we are talking about consumers, and I'm one of them too. I came up the exact same way. And when we hear terms like optimal being thrown around, when we hear, this versus that, and there's some measured difference, and the professionals are telling you that this is the thing that's going to give you the edge, that this is what you're better off doing in all possible circumstances, people are subject to the recency effect. They're going to focus on the last thing they've heard, and they end up doing that at the expense of just about everything else. So and I'm not calling anybody specifically dishonest, but it feels like there's kind of a lack of checking the process as people come out and make this type of content in a way that I think has a very real negative impact, given the way that we know consumers tend to engage with this type of stuff. And we can see it in other fields. I mean, pop psychology does the same thing, where people come out of the field and will take individual studies, anecdotes, whatever they come out of academia, and they'll write books and they'll kind of start their branding. And as time goes on, more research gets done, and you figure that it's a lot of flimsy ground that's kind of propping this stuff up. So I made a video that just kind of vented my frustrations, and it's something that I haven't really anchored into that much. Like in the last 5 years, I think I have made 2 videos about it, and it's a huge nebulous topic. And I end up going off on tangents. So we were talking about, the conversation going somewhere, it being concise. And I kind of bounce around a little bit, but every time I come back to it, I think I kind of zero in a little bit more. But then that brought us to the discussion I had with Pac and Milo, and, for whatever that was worth. And then that kind of brings us here today.
So let me ask you, what made you decide to revisit the topic here recently? Was it just overdue, or were you seeing a change in trends or the feedback that you were getting on videos, et cetera, that you thought that, okay, this is an issue I need to bring up again?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I've been making content for coming up on 6 years now. So eventually you revisit things, especially I probably have 10 times as many subs as I did back then. So when you look at the new audience, I mean, there's plenty of room to kind of revisit old videos, especially as production quality gets better. That video was edited. The last one I think was me just talking in front of a camera. So that was part of it, but it was definitely sparked by kind of the resurgence, I want to say, of evidence-based stuff, at least on my radar. I was starting to see a little bit more pop up with specific posts being made that I thought were maybe a little lazy or irresponsible. And I mean, I got to say, I like Milo and Pack. I like them a lot. They're nice guys. Look forward to talk to them in the future. But I know they lean heavily on the, we're PhDs. We're here to help you inform your training, given what we're doing, networking with other guys. There's other people that have degrees that are actual researchers or actually established in the field that I think do amazing work. And maybe I can criticize things here and there, but people tend to be pretty measured. So it's really, I think, when people break out of that a little bit and they're a little too eager to overrepresent what you could pull out of a single study or even a meta-analysis, that's kind of what triggered me a little bit. And I want to say I saw the language getting a little bit more loose. And again, it goes back to that relationship that they have with the consumers and how people get taught to interpret that type of stuff.
So one of the things I'm curious about, because my business is basically for coaches and trainers, right? And it's an education business, meaning that I'm constantly inundated with questions about other people's content and claims being made, et cetera, because these people, they want to learn. And they look at to me as an authority that can help them discern between all of the stuff. What's good, what's bad, what should I pay attention to? So I'm curious, even though for sure your most recent video, probably with the bigger following, had a larger reaction. Was there any discernible difference in the reaction in terms of, did it seem like we'll say the trust or we'll say anti-science sentiment is greater now than it was 2 years ago?
It is hard to say because of the magnitude. You mean from like my followers or like in the comments,
Yeah, just the,
or
just
just
the,
anybody
just
else
the
in the field?
overall response that you got. Do you feel like there's more support now for your take than there was 2 years ago?
So that's a hard thing, I would say, to discern just based upon how much I've grown in that time. So I have a lot more feedback to try to deal with. On the one hand, the video did well in terms of like likes to dislikes, I guess. And in the comment section, there was, I think, a lot of positive feedback, a lot of people that were kind of receptive to what I was trying to say, which is decidedly not anti-science. I think being skeptical of a scientific field, not skeptical, but being critical of a scientific field that has areas it can clean up that's not being addressed, that I think is specifically scientific, that you have to have checks and balances. You have to have that stress that kind of forces you to check your work. I would say that there was kind of a noisy reaction of people that were quick to say either you don't understand the science, and that was usually the end of it. There usually wasn't a follow-up saying specifically what I got wrong, which I'm open to the idea that something was misrepresented in there, but not a lot of specifics there. So it was either, yeah, that or just kind of the default that you're anti-science or these guys got it figured out. They have the degrees. The field's in its infancy. It's doing its work. It's doing what it's supposed to do. You don't know any better, and so on. But I will say that I think that was a pretty small chunk. I want to say the video is sitting on 84% of like likes to dislikes. And it's not like my audience is pre-selected one way or another for that. So I think that gives some insight into kind of the sentiment that exists right now.
Yeah, it's just curious because I actually did a bit of a poll on, Instagram. Well, what's people's, knee jerk reaction when they see the term science based as a piece of content? And I expected it to be relatively mixed, and it was very one sided. And I would say that on average, my audience would be more on the pro science page. I mean, we like a lot of our content is a little bit more technical, other than when I'm reacting to one of Paul Carter's comments or something like that. So I found that interesting. Now, there's a lot of factors that go in there. And I know that probably certain people just didn't want to actually even take the time to get involved in the conversation there, which is fine. In fact, I know a couple people actually, Jeff Nippert, for example, he commented and immediately deleted his comment. on there. And I'm like, yeah, okay.
Wow.
He commented and then he realized quickly that he didn't want to engage, which I understand, like, like walking into somebody else's comment section and dealing with that mob that's a whole unique thing to take on. And maybe it's not the most ideal place to have the conversation, but you can't eliminate the fact that once the comment section kind of gets some momentum in one direction, that itself can deter people just simply from wanting to participate in the conversation at that point in time.
Yeah.
But I did find it interesting, specifically since it was my audience, of how much of when I see science based, basically I have a negative feeling about that content. Which I would say, if I'm just basing it off content I see, is a sentiment that I share, right? Like, it's almost like I'm going in overly critical
Yes.
anytime I see this, because I'm like, okay, if you're calling the science based, I'm now going to be hypercritical of all of the claims and stuff that you make, because you have, to me, if somebody says science based, that raises the standard of what I expect, right? Right. Because if you're just like, hey, here's my opinion on a thing, cool. I'm happy to listen to your opinion and your logic of why that is, or cool. But when it has that preface of, yeah, this is just what I find works for me, or this is my opinion. But I think when people put science based on it, they're doing that for the clout that, hey, there's more truth. What I'm saying here sits above the anecdote or what the bros think, etc. And so then I have that. And I would say on average, that content tends not to live up to that expectation. And I think that's why so many people have kind of like started to develop, not to mention everything that's gone around in the world the last couple of years in terms of the word science. So that probably has trickled over into the fitness industry in terms of, well, there was definitely I think some comments in there that just reflected the things that have been going on in the world the last couple of years and a overall distrust in the word science. But I found that interesting. So if we don't have if it's hard to discern a difference in reaction over the last couple of years, that's fine. I would say that what I've noticed is not so much that there's a huge change in the way the content's being done, but I think we're seeing an expansion of the number of people that are taking that approach. Right. So I think you had a few people that took that approach, maybe starting 5, 10 years ago and built up massive followings. And all of a sudden here in the last 2 years, we've seen, I think, especially probably with like TikTok and whatnot, is that you've seen, oh, the now every workout is, here's the science-based back workout. We can no longer just have, here's the training, here's my workout. It's, hey, here's the workout I did based on science. So we've had, I think, a whole group of the younger generation adding that moniker to almost everything that we're doing. And to me, that would be like also one of the reasons why I'm seeing like this increased kind of like annoyance with the term science based, is it's not necessarily that the old hats have changed their approach so much as now there's this new, it's being shoved down your throat more in more places. I don't know if that's a sentiment you share.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I'm not on TikTok. I go out of my way to stay away from short form content, mainly because I don't trust myself on it to keep track of my day. It's such a time suck. But yeah, I know there's a whole ecosystem there that's brewing that's probably more dystopian than I'm aware of at the moment. But I think that's actually it. It's that you have a lot of people who are using that label because it sells. It's the term science is a very devastatingly effective marketing branding term, whether it's intended that way or not. You could have the best of intentions. You could think, no, I'm actually appealing to the science, but it gets used, it gets thrown out because people respond to it well. And I talked about this before. The average consumer knows enough to know that science does cool shit, that it gives you amenities, it gives you a higher quality of life, and it allows you to know the fundamental workings of nature. And that's all really cool. And you know enough that you should be deferring to that. But the average person also doesn't really have the literacy to discern. And I mean, it's hard for us, even in this field. I mean, I have somewhat of an education, but I've been in this field also for a very long time. it's even hard for me to get into the weeds and kind of parse out like where this makes sense, where they're overreaching. You can't expect consumers to do that either. So the communication is really, really important. And these lines get blurred when you have somebody with a degree, when their title says science based and they give you a program or a protocol or recommendation, whatever it's leaning on in terms of literature is extraordinarily limited on what it can say with confidence. The program still has to exist based on experience, preference, whatever other kind of normal standards exist in the field. And to the consumer, they don't know what the difference is. To them, every recommendation that comes out must be backed not just by some literature, but it must be like some conclusive idea that this is just the right way to do things. And anybody who isn't doing things this way must be losing something long term, that theoretically in 10 years you're not going to be as far ahead as you could have. And again, that reinforces, I think, like a very backwards, very flawed way of trying to engage with all these training variables, especially when you take into account what the individual needs, how that differs from everybody else. And then the thing that, you know, it's the bee in my bonnet is the dimension of time that doesn't seem to get addressed enough, which is, optimal changes as you become habituated to whatever it is that you're doing. And that's like a second order of complexity that you have to address. What do you do when the thing stops working? How does it change 5 years down, 10 years down, day to day, block to block? And that seems to be a place that we're not really at yet. And that seems to be like a big hole that the field right now can't really address. So yeah, that all of that makes my eyebrows raise when somebody puts that in their title.
Mhm. So you had the conversation with Milo and Pack, who were taking somewhat of an opposite stand. Walking away from that, are there any amendments you would make to the original video, or are there any caveats that you would add based off of that conversation?
Off the conversation, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, from the broader lens, I'm not good. I'd say I'm not good with debates. I'm not seasoned with debates. I mean, I would change the way I approach it. I actually feel like I could have pulled out more information from them because I was looking to see what these guys who went through the field, they have the degrees, they have PhDs. I feel like I have some things to learn about them. I've learned from them about the inner workings of this system, maybe things I misspoke on, maybe things that I should be educated on that I misrepresented that caused that gap in our understanding. So I do wish that I engaged it a little more aggressively, that I fixated on a couple smaller points, and that I did kind of pull more of a conversation out of it. Cause I mean, as you said before, it kind of meandered, kind of put people to sleep. I don't think it really got to the point. I think it was longer than it needed to be. I made a mistake of trying to address every single point, which I absolutely should not have done. And that's a mistake I won't make in the future. But I can't think of a point that was made. I'm not saying there isn't one, but I can't think of a point that was made that would cause me to rethink any of my initial stances. In fact, some of the things that they got to kind of had me leaving with what I already believed a little more reinforced.
Yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of talking past, like almost like there was two conversations going
Yeah.
on. And I think that's when you have a topic like this that's so nebulous and it's so big, it's very, very easy to do that. If I'm sitting here and weighing the conversation, I think some of the best points that they made were kind of addressing the evolution of the research now. I mean, so we can talk about all of the limitations that exist in the literature, but it is also worth noting how much is changing in terms of what we're getting out of the most recent literature in terms of, okay, study design is getting better, transparency is getting better. There's still a lot to be desired,
Sure.
but it is moving in a positive direction where we are getting a little bit better quality data. And if it keeps trending in that direction, that's good. Can we wish that it would be faster and more? Absolutely. I don't think it's anywhere what it needs to be, especially on the transparency side. I mean, every time there's a study on squats, the first thing is like, what do those squats look like? I mean, that we live in the day of everybody's got a camera in their pocket, right? It shouldn't be too hard to start actually getting some of this additional data so that there's just a little bit more transparency on there. But I mean, moving from things like the binary of significant and not significant to effect sizes and actually showing individual data, not just averages and things like that. I think we are moving into those things, and there is a effort to get population sizes up and to have more ecologically valid things in there.
Sure.
And, I can have a kind of a foot in both things. Like we built our own little lab here to be able to do as much in-house research to fill in the gaps for what just the questions that we have. I can I can empathize with the difficulty of the research process, but also empathize with what I want, as a coach, what I want to be able to extract from that information. Right. And, I can kind of understand the limitations. So I
Mm.
think that was one of the things that I took from both Milo's response and that conversation is that that's maybe a layer of context to put in there is that things are getting a little bit better in the
Yeah.
science realm. Um, but conversely, I would say there are some areas it's getting worse, but go ahead and say what you're
Yeah, and he had made the point, and I think he had made the point that he had taken issue with it. The video was kind of one sided, like I wasn't showing kind of the positive side of things. I'm a little on the fence about that. I don't know if that was actually my job with a video that's supposed to be critical. I mean, I guess I could have provided a more balanced view, but the key context to the video that I was making, and I run into this a lot when I'm critical of systems or people or figures, is that it's not so much to like wag my finger at the people in the field, the researchers, or even really a lot of the influencers, although I think some of them can clean it up a little bit. That whole bit that I ran down about flaws with the research, problems they're running into, was really for the viewers that I think by and large aren't entirely aware. Because again, it goes back to the consumer seeing the stamp science approved and thinking it's all figured out. And it was a very hard conversation to have. I probably didn't even do it that well because it requires a certain communication skill and concise speech. But all academic disciplines aren't created equal in their ability to inform the thing they're trying to manipulate. They're on different wavelengths, they're working around different obstacles. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking like this happened in a lab at a university by a bunch of guys with decades of experience. So it's set. And it's once you start to break down the data, I can appreciate it's getting better. I mean, you would definitely want that. And I'm sure there's some good things that can come out of that. But I really just had to drive the point home to the average person who's inclined to click on a Nippered video or anybody else for that matter and think, well, the science is where it's at. It's there are holes in this stuff that you have to be aware of. And if you're not, you're going to be led down the path of thinking that it's more concrete than it is. And again, that leads you to bad decision making when there's very, very, very important things in your own life, in your own training that you can actually sink your teeth into that will have monumentally more of an impact on what you do moving forward. So again, it was really for the consumer, but I can appreciate that I, could have softened it a bit, but a little more charitable to some of the changes that have been made.
I don't think you needed to soften it. I just like if I'm putting this in the mix of like how I would approach it, if anything, like you said, I think you could have been even a little bit more aggressive into the limitations and getting into a little bit more specifics there. But we're also looking at something that's evolving over time. So it's simultaneously important to point out the limitations that we have in some of the older research, but it's also then just as informative for the person to understand, hey, some of these limitations are being overcome or we're taking steps in the direction. In the new research, this isn't a permanent state of, okay, cool, because we didn't have this, we weren't controlling things and doing this stuff, back in this study in the 90s or whatever, doesn't mean that now when a new piece of research comes out that you have to look at it as having all the same limitations. We have to look at, well, there's taking steps to overcome limitations. What would that look like? And obviously that's making the conversation a lot longer for people. But I think overall, like for the consumer, that's kind of like, it's not just, hey, it's what are those limitations? But then what it would be like is, okay, what is science going to look like or how would it overcome those limitations? Is any of that stuff starting to be applied to the most recent research. And if it is, then cool. Cause then we can start weighing a little bit more credibility towards better quality research. Just even if we're just doing the figuring out for ourselves approach, there's going to be things that we can look at more confidently than others based off of the confounding variables in our own lives and experiences. Yeah. So I don't think that your approach was overly pessimistic. I just think that, I mean, this is a conversation that there's always more, to be had on it. And then, again, it's tough to navigate of how much of this do I fit in a single video. And for the average consumer, what is that attention span going to be,
Yeah.
et cetera. So it's very easy for us to sit here and be like, well, you could have said this and you could have said that. So don't take that as a criticism of the video, but knowing my audience being a little bit more interested in the nuance, that's kind of like that's the piece that I would have put in there. And I want to kind of talk about the general fields, because I think when it comes to exercise science, that's a big umbrella, like in terms of what fits underneath there. And I think too much is focused on just, okay, cool. Here's the latest meta-analysis on volume or training to failure. And people are only looking at these longitudinal studies that are trying to eke out these little nuances or whatnot. And we forget that actually there is a ton, if anything, in terms of what impacts like how you go about coaching someone on a day to day. We probably rely more on foundational sciences, like something as simple as anatomy and physics are very much a part of what we do in the gym, if not more of a part of what we do at the gym than any study looking further down the nuances. So that's the other caveat that what I put it would kind of look at is, okay, what is actually like, what does the umbrella of exercise science cover and how much of that are we applying? Because, if we look at how useful science is in terms of the coaching process, if we limit that to only the most nuanced longitudinal studies, then we could be like, oh yeah, I'm working with individuals and they have all this variance. But if we include the totality of sciences that make up exercise science, including the ones that we use most, it's okay, cool. Like, how do we know that doing elbow flexion works how do we know we help a biceps? Like, how far back do we go? And so if I was going to kind of take, okay, maybe science deserves a little bit more credit, it would be actually the more fundamental sciences that we use very much on a day-to-day practice. Like every time you're watching somebody and you're watching their technique, you're looking at their anatomy, you're looking at their mechanics, you're looking at physics happening in real time, right? Everything from rep speed to bar path to, okay, how do we position yourself relative to a cable or the incline on the bench, et cetera. Like we're applying all of these sciences in coaching, right? And these are sciences where I think we can apply it at an individual level, like at an N of one level. Like I can look at somebody and see that, okay, their chest is a little bit different shaped or their rib cage is a little different shaped. And I can apply physics and mechanics to their unique anatomy. And so I can get to that kind of N of one level with those things, unlike what I can do from a longitudinal study where it's, okay, we took a certain population of people and we did this. That is then harder to take to the individual. It's not necessarily useless, but there's a lot of steps in between there in terms of saying, okay, well, generally this is what happens. That gives me maybe a better guess or a probability of where to start. And then I can start actually looking at taking what I would say is a scientific approach to coaching, which, I mean, if you use the Anna curve, the fuck around and find out, right? I mean, that is the scientific method in its simplest form, right? And a lot of times that's what we're doing with an individual. And I think when we look at what we have from the nuance level of these longitudinal studies, a lot of what it's doing is okay, it's trying to give us almost like some bumpers, of, okay, like the 52 set study on volume. Was the question, is 52 sets the best volume for hypertrophy? No, I don't think that was what the researchers were going for. What they were trying to figure out is, hey, what is the point of just, okay, this is too much. They're trying to figure out where those bumpers are, right? And same thing for the research on minimal effective dose. It's not, okay, cool. This means that you only have to do this much and that's the most optimal approach. It's like trying to kind of narrow the window of, okay, there's a higher probability that someone's going to exist. And the tighter that window gets, then the better we can guess at a starting position to kind of start that fuck around and find out process for a particular person. And then principally, we can be like, okay, if I take that individual person's data and I know that, okay, they've been training this much, this many years, this is what their history looks like, et cetera, I can move them within that probability window. Okay, probably this person is going to need a little bit more, or is going to need be a little bit less. But having that window, just simply knowing what that size of the window knows whether that means you're pushing, whether more is, well, we should try 2 sets more versus we should try 10 sets more, et cetera.
Yeah, and the term science is a big landmine because again, these nebulous discussions that we have, we run into the pitfalls of language being limited in all the ways that it is. And I mean, you mentioned us kind of speaking over each other's head in the last discussion that we had, because science can mean a whole bunch of different things. I'm like, I made a point because I'm referring to science as what goes on with like formal research, what goes on with these, published papers and the entire system that operates around that. And I was making some point that discovery of what works, especially with the complex organisms of human beings, where you're almost better having just an immense amount of people going through a selective process as opposed to trying to kind of like granularly build up the best practices from like an atomic level up. I made a comment like, we learned to, I don't know, farm, build pyramids, whatever. One of the comments was like, we didn't use science to build the pyramids. And so obviously that's not what I was like going for. So it's like, it's, yeah, yes, a systematic discovery for truth with an a priori assumption that there is a physical objective reality that we can know. And you're like, yes, that exists. Excuse me. So to your point about, yeah, using, excuse me, using physics, one of the most productive things about my education was anatomy and physiology. Excuse me. Sorry. Sorry, I inhaled some of my Celsius. That's what I get for trying to drink and talk. Anatomy and physiology, all the biology classes, physics classes, healthy amount of chemistry classes, and understanding like it's in as much as you pick the body apart to look at smaller structures, it's much easier to have these universal rules that are more fixed. Like you can look at an individual muscle and kind of conceptualize what's going on if you can control for the leverage it has based on the things you know about the individual and how they're different from someone else. That's obviously quite a bit different, right? Than when you have a bunch of individuals and you're trying to make assumptions about an average without calculating those individual differences. So, yeah, it's very useful to have that scientific foundation. In fact, it's essential, I would say, but it just kind of stretches like what it is that we're talking about. I feel like one of the big problems with exercise science that I was critical of is that over reliance on being able to make kind of strong predictions based on averages, based on models that just fundamentally don't have the ability to count all of the confounding variables.
Yeah. So I think an important discernment, I think, like if I'm displaying my own critique of, and I look at it more as, we'll say I'm not critiquing science in the essence of science, but it's the usage of the term, which I think it is this, okay, this is science based and it is the interpretation. And I think a big part of it also is that I, I see this trend of science being like, it's a clout chase, right? And there's this pattern of anybody that has the smallest amount of credibility in any one scientific field now almost looks at their speech as, now my opinions are now science.
Yes.
And that's the way that I look at a lot of this stuff, is that even if somebody has a PhD, that they're not necessarily taking we'll say, a very evidence or science-based approach to the content they're making. They're leveraging the fact that they had that academic credibility and were using science-based as a marketing tool to give an opinion or to make claims in a way that is not, we'll say, relative to the confidence that we could. And some if I'm throwing around some examples of things, and I actually love to debate. I don't know that I'm particularly good at it. I just enjoy it, not for the argument's sake, but I love problem solving. And so, anytime there's two opposing views on an issue, I want to sit and pick those apart and kind of, try and find the best possible resolution. Um, but in that process, like the number of basic things that have been overlooked, like something as simple as not understanding the simple origin insertion of a muscle, or somebody having a PhD in biomechanics, not understanding that if the joint is in a different position, then the orientation of the muscle is now different. We can't just be like, well, in the book it says the muscle has this function. I'm like, yeah, but not when your arm is or leg is in this position. That function no longer exists. And I don't know if that is a problem with the educational system, or that people just get to the point where they are almost ignoring the foundational sciences and they're so focused on these nuanced things that a lot of the inaccuracy just becomes from, because I, I'm not none of these. If you get a PhD, you're clearly not a stupid person, right? I don't think we can say that. But is there a is there a condition right now where people that have a high academic level have started overlooking some of these foundational things? And I think when they are things that you're a person that didn't have a PhD, but maybe they know a little bit about anatomy, and they see that mistake make it on such a fundamental level, all of a sudden that starts chipping away at that credibility. And to me, right now, as somebody sitting in between, I am having a difficult time defending defending a lot of the people making the science-based content, not because they don't have some good points, but because simultaneously there's also some gaping holes in what they're doing in the claims. And like when I look at somebody like, you know, we'll say, well, we've already said Paul Carter's name a couple times, so we'll just use like a Paul Carter, right? You know, I'll listen to something he said or whatever, right? And he may have a legit valid criticism, right? He might also have an outright lie every 5 minutes in his piece of content, but because some of those criticisms are valid, that is enough then that, okay, now people are going to see, okay, well, this is clearly right. And maybe this over here is clearly right. And now I don't know what to listen to because we have these diametric views, if that's even the right word. And I think that is making almost like we'll say a pull away or a diversion. So instead of the conversation converging, you get like a divergence, right? It's in a sense of, okay, well, I'm just going to not address that issue rather than say, yeah, actually, this was a mistake or I overstepped the claim here, whatever. I don't see people go back and delete old content that either is not aligned with our current views, or hey, this was science based in 2015. That video is still on YouTube, even if the science, quote unquote, has changed. I don't see a lot of that. I think we'll say, if there is a finger to wag in terms of a criticism of science, I think the blame goes to the academic community and the scientific community for creating the opportunities for kind of like, oh, hey, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, rather than them addressing the limitations directly and kind of being more upfront with those. Like I don't want to ramble on here too much, so just feel free to cut me off. But I find it always useful to give examples where I can. But so, for instance, let's just take the volume topic because that cycles around, no pun intended, every now and then. But the critiques about blind measuring, those are valid critiques, right? The transparency of methods, the fact that, okay, yes, they measured, they did the measurement 72 hours after the last training session and the argument that, okay, there's going to be an edema correlated with volume and whatnot. It's okay. Those are valid critiques. And I think what I see from the academic community is to either dismiss those critiques. And, in the sake of blind measuring, some labs for sure are doing a very good job of now doing blind measuring. But for something simple like the edema question of like, all right, well, cool. After the study, a certain amount of inflammation is going to be present. A certain amount of fluid accumulation is going to be present, especially if you've done 52 sets that week for quads. And especially if that volume is somewhat novel. And if we don't actually take the step back and do the research to be looking at, okay, what we need to do is research the measuring method and figure out what would actually be the appropriate time. To me, that's where I see the fault is on not actually taking the step of, hey, before we do this study where we're going to take people and do all these sets for however many weeks, why don't we do the study on the methodology or the measurement so that then we can remove those criticisms so we can stand on that. If we're going to do a volume study and we're going to be ascending volume, progressively increasing it over time, then what we need to do is look at, say, okay, if we do that acutely and then we measure somebody 48, 72, 96, whatever, right? Can we actually get some good evidence to show that, like, all right, at a certain given point, we can assume that that is no longer a confounding variable and have that contextually relevant to the big study that we're going to do. And I think those missteps, those then take away from not only what can be claimed, but they also open the door for a lot of people making these criticisms to then point out like, well, this was a problem with the study. Therefore, my opposing view is true. And that's what I see a lot of on the other side. And they're also calling their content science-based, right? Where it's just, okay, I'm going to point out one limitation in this study, or it's two limitations. And therefore, I'm going to discredit that and just use that to argue my point. And to me, that is I say probably the most confusing thing for the consumer. But I think the fault lies in the research community not being thorough enough in design, but also just in addressing that in their interpretation. Like, I think if you know there's a weakness, you should be the first one to talk about it rather than leaving yourself open to being exposed for it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And that calls back to, I mean, the example that was kind of burned into my brain with my criticisms. It was, and I pick on Jeff a lot. Generally, I like Jeff, and I think he's a smart guy. But this image I have of him with 10 studies, and they're all going in like a pro or con list for whatever variable that he's looking at. And when I think about the discussion, I'm remembering the things he was saying where he's commenting on the way it was done, things that did or didn't take into account. And in real time, he's kind of making his own value judgments about, well, we can use this or we can't, or this one works against it, but we're going to forget it because of, X, Y, or Z. And that's kind of what you were talking about. Like, it's very easy to cherry pick without really even knowing it, because so much of what you have to do to make sense of any of this is rely on your experience and intuition. If you just start in college and that's all you know, if you haven't been in a gym or trained people or engaged with this stuff in any other way, you're going to be like 10 steps behind. And I feel like that's what people do. And it goes back to you saying that the people in this field, the communicators, they kind of become the science because they're the ones interpreting. There's a lot of interpretation that has to go on. And it's just very, very, very easy for there to be a complete blurring of the things you say that are your best interpretation of this particular group of studies versus how that informs everything else downstream, that you're also taking steps 3, 4, 5, 6 to get there on your own. To what degree is it science, and to what degree is it just your best educated opinion based on experience and a bunch of other stuff? And it was funny, like I saw you posted the Israel clip from Fuad's podcast earlier today. And that was one of those examples. Like, you have the idea that Ronnie Coleman, who's one of the best bodybuilders of all time, not even for his era. It's not like talking about a silver or golden era guy. You're talking about a guy who still is the pinnacle of what human beings could get. The idea that if you change this one variable, obviously he would have had more mass on his legs. Uh, Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Perhaps. But the idea that that's some type of foregone conclusion because of what the literature says, that requires you taking several steps away from what the literature can support on its own. And I think that's it. And again, I'm a big fan of Mike. Usually he's very measured. It's one of the things that stands out when he's talking about ranges. It's always like this: here's what doing too much looks like, here's what's not enough. It's all very grounded in experience. But when you're printing team full range of motion t-shirts, it's, you smoke a little weed, you go on a podcast, and next thing you know, you're trying to say, well, it's obviously if this one thing was a little bit different, the world's best bodybuilder would have been better. To go back to what you were saying though about the academics, they're not stupid. Certainly they're not stupid, but I mean, the most brilliant people can be given to the same type of flaws, getting comfortable in a career, checking boxes, doing the work. I think people look at the field they're in through rose colored glasses. I got a comment like that from Milo when he was kind of defending, oh, these people aren't getting rich. They're doing it because they love it. And I think that's a very biased and probably incorrect view of what goes on in any job where you're expected to do a certain amount of output to get a paycheck. And it probably stops being sexy after a while. And some people go in bright eyed and full of wonder and give it their best game, and some people just punch the clock, and some people commit fraud. Like, it's like that everywhere you go. And I don't think academia is different from it. But what stands out to me is the incentive structures that exist, because where there are very, very, very high stakes, you are going to have the best talent engaging in all of the relevant details and not leaving any stone unturned, because that's where your career gets made. That's where the next paradigm shifting thing gets discovered. And this is where I start to sound like a prick when I talk about exercise science. The stakes are just extraordinarily low. There's nothing really important. I love this field. I like engaging in this stuff. Thankfully, I have enough free time where I can take on discussions like this and consider it a good use of my time. But what billionaire is going to fund exercise science to push the snatch record forward 5 kilograms? Like, we already know how to get people pretty strong, pretty muscular, enough to be healthy, enough to improve their longevity. Now we're talking about like granular details to push human performance forward a little bit. By the way, to push human performance forward the dumbest way possible, from like a technological standpoint, we're exploiting this weird trick of our body to adapt in these weird ways. And I feel like by the time the field's like good and robust enough to do what we want it to do, it's like weightlifting by itself is probably going to be this archaic thing. And we'll have so many other interventions. But that's my weirdo kind of black pilled view of it. I really think that the consequential information, the stuff that makes a difference, diffuses in any arena. So when you have these academics, the things that they pay attention to, the things that they learn, it's what's relevant to their field day to day. And the criticisms you had about these guys with biomechanics degrees not knowing X, Y, or Z, you have to ask yourself, I mean, at what point in the types of things they're studying, the types of things they're doing, are they punished for not knowing that? Because if it's something that they don't get bit in the ass for not knowing, it's going to go in one ear and out the other, even if it's something that they should specifically know. So I look a lot at incentives. I look at the stakes that are present. I look at who's doing checks, what reason anybody has to up their game. Is there something on the line, or is it possible for people to get the degree, go through the rigmarole, and just start punching the clock and do what most people do when they're in a job they're kind of fed up with, which is just do the bare minimum until they get their pension.
Yeah. I don't like to take away from anybody that like does the work to get higher education or does the work anywhere for that matter. But I do think that the internal accountability is extremely poor. I think that's why we're in the state where we're at right now, where the only accountability there is backlash on these platforms or somebody doing a reaction video to your content and like that. Like the peer reviewed process, I think is so broken that right now the main form, or at least the most impactful form of credit of accountability, is actually coming through dissenting opinions on these platforms, and that often doesn't come from within the same community. Like I do not see the I see like camps, right? For the most part, right? I will joke sometimes when I make a post on Dr. Whoever's account or whatever and ask a question and be like, yeah, I'll probably just get told to go sit at the little kids table and know my place by bringing this up here. But, I'm the only one that's not afraid to ask the question or point this out. So I'll go ahead and do it because I have experienced some of the funniest examples of double standards where I will say, I will ask a question or make a statement, and then somebody else that is part of the approved, they're in the approved camp, will say almost exactly the same thing. And the response that will be given to me versus the other person are like completely different. And so I think in terms of academia, the internal accountability has to be fixed, and I think we're kind of in this weird place as far as humanity goes, where we don't know how to be ourselves and we have to have an ideology attached to everything. And that's a very dangerous thing when it comes to, training methodologies and science and whatever. Like if all of a sudden your ideology is attached to a particular thing being right, and then all of a sudden there's a group of those people, who's going to be the person within that group that's, hey, maybe this isn't, maybe there's this valid criticism or whatever, rather than everybody just becoming increasingly more resistant, or we'll say just turning a blind eye, to that. Because, and this is something that I had Pack on here last week and I forgot to bring this up. But when it comes to the conflict of interest, usually you read a study and there's, oh, here's the conflict of interest. I don't know that anyone that's in the science communication space, because basically there's very few people in the science communication space that haven't started to attach some ideology with their branding, right? Like all of a sudden, okay, cool, we're the ROM guys or we're the volume guys or whatever it is, right? And at that point, any research that is remotely connected to those topics, now there has to be a conflict of interest because your brand now is associated with this outcome and you're making content on it, and that content is affecting your credibility. It's in a lot of cases it's affecting them monetarily. I mean, I think this is a weird point in terms of science where we're seeing a lot of these, not even just grad students doing the research or whatnot, are active on these social platforms. And now you're seeing a communication from a much, much younger and less experienced group. And I think that there's positives and negatives. I do think that a lot of these guys are much more interested in the trenches than the people that were maybe doing some of this research years past. I think there's more people that have a actual applied like for themselves, and that they are in the strength and conditioning, they train themselves and they enjoy that aspect and they're getting involved in that. I think that is a good trend, but I also think that there's a lot of people now that have a voice so much earlier, in their career, right? If we take Milo and Pack, for instance, right? They both have their PhDs, right? But if we're just talking about the timeline, you and I probably have as much time professionally coaching as they have training themselves combined.
Yeah.
Us being the similar ages, starting around the same times, is like, and that's not taking away from them. But I also know some of what I knew in the gym at that point relative to what I know now, not from like just a science perspective, but like just the things that you learn from an experience over time. Simply like the number of training methods you've been exposed to, the number of exercises, just the simple amount of things that you've actually had time to try out, and the number of people that you've actually been able to observe, you can't discount that. And so there's a lot of people that are fresh out of academia and have a very low experience out of maybe their own training, or who knows, maybe they're like coaching or whatnot. But I'm like, okay, how many people have you coached? maybe it's double digits. And until that gets way, way, way up, you're still looking at a very, especially when we talk about the limitations of what we can do, in terms of just in-person observation. If we need a certain population in a research study, when we're talking about what we're doing in our own observations, we need an order of magnitude greater number of bodies to be able to even get close to pulling some of those same kind of conclusions and anecdotes out. So
Yeah.
that's something interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The conflict of interest thing is kind of an interesting one. And I've thought about that a lot because I've been kind of comparing this to what does go on in other fields. And it seems so obvious, seems self evident that if you have this system that turns out researchers and they're supposed to have this very kind of objective, very self critical view of a critical view of themselves and the system as well. I mean, they should be checking each other as aggressively as possible. And you would think they would if the prize was that next big finding that you're not going to get unless your shit is just airtight. That's what you would want. And it seems like that gets directly challenged by a system where it's just fine if people who got their degrees, or even in Milo's case, I mean, he was making content before he had his PhD all the way through. Not that there's anything wrong with that specifically, but the fact that you do have people who their first maneuver is to build a relationship with a population of people, establish themselves as an authority, not based on a nebulous amount of experience, but based on this specific schooling that I was going through, and then use that to relay my conclusions, what I've discovered so far, what I think is the way to do things, even more so in a way that's not like some consensus, because any one of us could do this experiment. If you have a goal or if you have a contest you're getting ready for, I almost like threw out a challenge. Okay, I'm getting ready for Worlds at the end of this year. If I send every piece of information about myself to 10 different PhDs or evidence-based guys, what am I going to get back? I'm going to get back 10 completely disparate programs that could just as easily be thrown out there. So it seems like that absolutely is going to challenge their ability to be objective when their branding, their finances are directly tied in to perpetuating the thing that they think is correct. The hierarchies are kind of weird. I'm a big fan of hierarchies in disciplines. I reference martial arts a lot as kind of this model that I like wish lifting was, people engaging aggressively in these discrete schools of thought where the same principles are at play, but you can tweak them a little bit and then you can try those out against all these others. And if you have enough people, you can find some really, really complex solutions you couldn't have built from scratch on your own. But you have to know who's the person who's been around the block and who's the person who's still kind of cutting their teeth. And it's weird when we have these different coefficients for, well, this person's been coaching for 20 years, but they have a seventh grade education versus this person, produces world champions, but the system they use is kind of wonky and isn't really applicable to the normal person. But this person has a PhD, so that's pretty cool. But they're also really young and kind of inexperienced, but they're not hesitant to say exactly what they think. And it's like all of these different archetypes for authority that we're juggling. And I don't know what to do with it. How the hell is the consumer supposed to know what to do with it? I don't know how to evaluate these people. All I can do is look at it and be like, based on what I know, does any of this make sense? And we're almost to the point where we can't lean on the benefit of those types of labels to figure out if somebody's full of shit. It's almost to the point where it's like we really and truly just have to look at what's being said, evaluate it based on what we kind of collectively know, and then determine that from scratch. If that's a positive or a negative, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I think we're in a time where I don't think that we can trust any credential at this point, whether that you can't just be like, okay, the guys with experience, they know what they're doing. That's that's not universally true. The guys with the degrees, they know what they're doing. Can't apply that. So I think one of the biggest challenges for consumers right now is there isn't a credential that they can lean on to know that, okay, this is good. And I don't have a good solution for that. I
Yeah.
don't know that anybody, like, the only solution, which is an extremely inconvenient solution, is, well, you need to learn all these things on your own and get the experience on your own. And then then when you become an expert, then you'll be able to know who the experts are. But that kind of doesn't help you if you're just want to be able to, like, hey, I don't want to become a professional at this. I just want some helpful advice from the field, and I want to know whose advice I should take. And
Yeah.
like I said, I don't have a solution for that right now, other than, other than what I'm doing, which is okay. I provide education, right? It's okay. The only thing I could do is provide education, and hopefully that empowers you. And then if, it gives you at least a better chance of being able to discern when people are talking into greater nuances. You have a greater understanding of the foundations, under that. And we try and leverage the importance of understanding what are the limitations, what are the individual. Our brand is N1, literally based off of the N of one, and to kind of look at things through that lens rather than, hey, there's an absolute approach, which,
Yeah. I think, and I think you only need I think you only need the credentials. I think you really only need that in a system where you need to be justified in making very, very, very specific claims. And I think one of the beautiful things about lifting, it kind of ties into the low stakes thing, but it's that there are so many things that work. And it seems like a big kind of trap that people fall into when they think that optimal is worth chasing, because the thing that kills you if you're going to be around for several years, it's not how much you grew in the first 3 weeks or 6 weeks. It's going to be, could you sustain that over time? Could you bypass that? So, optimal, as far as I'm concerned, long term, is being able to have some growth. It's just like the stock market. Like, you have people chasing big investments because they think, well, I could potentially hit it really big. But the real world risk in training is that you lose the plot and ditch a whole bunch of other really important things for this new shiny thing you looked at. When the people that make the most money just attach their investments to the market and let those little incremental growths happen. And I feel like as long as people can do that, as long as they can kind of take in the good news that, like, hey, there's a lot of shit that works. If you get stuck on certain things, there's experimentation you can do, but no matter who you are, your path to being the best possible thing you could be, 100% no bones about it, hinges on making tweaks specific to you and your circumstances. That is going to require some trial and error, is going to require some creativity. There's no way around that. And that's one of the things that's one of those things that makes me a little more cynical on the field, is because as long as you have that reality, then it's just a question of, okay, well, what guidelines are we setting for people to start with? And then even there, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of things that look that different than how they've been over the last 50 or even 100 years. And as long as people are paying attention, and that's a whole different rabbit hole I could go down, is what people should be focused on, not just ignoring optimal, but instead of trying to program hop, or instead of trying to take the last shiny object they found and make their training center around that, learn how to pivot your training according to your own needs, learn how to manipulate dosages, learn how to take notes, learn how to retain what worked, instead of saying, well, man, I had a really good session, but or I had a really good block of training, but you know what? I really want to try this other program over here. So let me just ditch that and go do this other thing. As long as people can retain the things that tend to work, take notes, and get an intuition, the average person, that's going to take them as far as they could potentially go. And then it leaves me feeling like the rest of the discussion about this really, really fine, specific proclamations about what is optimal, or what theoretically is going to be the best possible thing. I feel like it's a way to kind of scratch our beards and flex how much studying we've done over the last 10 or 20 years and kind of humor ourselves in the meantime. But I'm left wondering, in real terms, again, the regular population, I know there's like a special subset of people that are like going for every inch they can take. But for most of the consumers, it just feels very inconsequential.
I want to move in the direction of moving forward, making this better, and actually get into a little bit of what your approach is. And so let me start that with actually using kind of the martial arts analogy that you use, right? If we take every divisional champion in the UFC right now, right? Because I think about mixed martial arts is the best example, right? Is that okay? Some of these guys are going to be strikers, some of them are going to be grapplers, some of them are going to be jujitsu, some of them are going to be more balanced. So they're all the best. And even if we look at the goats, we're not going to see a consistency of that they all basically follow this one uniform methodology or whatever. But what I think we can do, if we were to look at all of those, is what there probably is a minimum threshold across like disciplines, meaning that you're likely not going to be a champion if you have no wrestling or no jujitsu or no strength. So what's probably the thing to look for is that, okay, there's a certain threshold that you need across all of these things. And that's something that we teach a principle of thresholds where we look at the training variables and basically say, okay, before you look at trying to perfect or optimize one particular variable, the most important thing is that you're hitting a threshold of competence across all of the things. And if you do that, you will outperform anybody that is hyper focused on one thing, right? So if somebody is, sacrificing effort for technique or sacrificing training for nutrition or whatever it may be, like they're going to get less overall progress than somebody that's just like, hey, let's get all of this stuff to a fairly competent level. And I think when it comes to what we can take away and what we can gain from science. So in the conversation with Milo, there was something about if we could do a study where we take like all the data of all the people in the world and throw it into an AI computer, would we get like this singular methodology? And I think that's a poor question to ask because I think it's the wrong question to ask. I guess I should say is just like to expect that there would be a singular outcome because we know that there won't be a singular outcome because humans are varying. But what we could expect is an improvement in the algorithm because that's essentially what we're doing as coaching is we're using our own internal algorithm to kind of take in all of the qualities of an individual, every data point that we know. And then we're making a decision for them based off of that algorithm. And then we're just continually feeding data in and refining that over time. So where exercise science takes us, or just science in general, is it's just more data, I think, going into that algorithm. And I don't think that you can extract everything that you've gained from science and then all of a sudden be like, okay, here's how I would now think and approach things with zero scientific information. That's not something that we can fathomably do, right? We can't. We just have that. So the things that we may think are common sense or truisms, or we don't know that if we would still have that belief, if we didn't also have, there was some of this in the field, but there was also some of this in the research or whatever. And ultimately they influence each other too. So what happens in the field is influenced by the research and vice versa. So we can't pull this stuff apart. And so I think what we do is we just try and take everything for what it is. And so I think the way to properly apply science is that's exactly what you do is that you take what you can to refine your algorithm. And if that means that the research helps you narrow down the probability and have a better starting point, cool. If that means that it helps influence the decision-making process for, okay, what do you do when things don't work? Science isn't going to give you the definite answer, but it could give you, right now, it can help us be like, well, it's probably more likely this than this. So start there, right? And the same thing happens. We get the same type of information from coaching experience. We don't you could have worked with 1,000 people in the past. That does not give you the blueprint for the next one person in front of you. But all that experience does do is it refines the algorithm so that basically when you have that one person in front of you, you're going to be more likely to be able to estimate what they need. You're going to be more likely to be able to troubleshoot for them faster, right? But you're not going to, it's insane to think that no matter how many people that you coach, that then you can expect that you can coach any one individual perfectly, right? I mean, yeah, theoretically cool. Like by the time we get down to the point where we can be like, oh yeah, no, I know exactly what this person's quarks look like, beyond, okay, cool. Maybe by then we can do this. But like the thing that you were mentioning earlier is like, by the time we figure this out, will it even matter? No, like gene doping will be to the point now. It's like, yeah, training really doesn't matter. You just take this and then, do whatever you want, right? Hit now is the best thing because you do need to do almost nothing. You take these pills, whatever. But that's how I look at both like utilization of science, but also I think it's important that we understand what our expectations should be from science. Like we shouldn't expect science to give us the answer for an individual, but what it should do is refine our ability to make decisions with that individual data included. And
Okay.
I think the more that is communicated, I think that's not only going to help the people that are consuming the information, right? But I think it'll also kind of help kind of bridge the gap between, oh, I'm anti or I'm pro science. And it's like once you see how these tools work together, then you don't have to it's not a binary, but you can misuse either tool. You can misuse your experience. Like you can develop terrible biases, right? And then you can also be extremely ignorant of the individual by just taking the quote unquote just evidence-based approach. When in reality, you need to take both of those things to fine tune your algorithm. So my question to you, other than just your general thoughts on that, would be like, is that a process you kind of incorporating, and how does that look for you?
Yeah. So when I was working with people, it was the culmination of what tended to be done in the field because there was consensus. Let's say I worked mostly with competitive strongman athletes, which is kind of a bizarre field to get into because it's not just hypertrophy, it's not just strength. There's no consistency of implements. So you're physically constrained by the demands of a competition cycle or a yearly competition cycle because you don't know the implements sometimes until 4 or 6 weeks out from a show. So you have to be good at running kind of your baseline amount of work. Then you have to know what kind of the appropriate timeline to peak for each event is. Those are different. If you have a max effort yoke run, the way you peak that is going to be very different than a very light like sandbag medley. So a lot of that, basically my success as a coach in strongman had probably infinitely more to do with special knowledge about how each individual event hit a person. I have really shit leverages for strongman. I'm built like a dachshund. I have short arms and a long torso. Bending over to a barbell is difficult. Forget about getting my fingers under a sandbag. And I've had to really kind of strain to figure that stuff out. So I had a lot of insight to give to other people. And I could put together really good. It's probably the thing I'm best at is peaking for contests for that reason. But everything else was a matter of breaking down, okay, what are your leverages? Oh, you have a +7 ape index. It's congratulations. You can pick up anything and run with it. And I could take that stuff and kind of guess what the impact of each event was going to be, what the tolerance is going to be. And then of course you have to ask questions because you think it's going to be that way and then maybe it's not. Maybe they tell you, yeah, I'm built to deadlift, but I have a shit ton of low back injuries. Every contest is, hey, how do you work the deadlift to maximal capacity, which is one of the most strenuous single lifts you can do while also doing 5 other events that are also entirely posterior chain dominant. Anyways, but yeah, it's like algorithm. It's like you said, it's pattern recognition. Is that perfect with human beings? Far from it, but it's also a lot better than whatever alternatives we have. And over many people, you get kind of an intuition and you get kind of an intuition and you get really good at figuring out what a safe baseline is, which it's really just playing the middle ground as much as you can. What are the extremes? What's a reasonable point to start? And then you get very good at perceiving the signs that things are going sideways so you can pivot as quickly as possible. That has always stuck with me because the success has always been not what you start with. In fact, what you start with is almost irrelevant because if I start you too low, too high, too much, too little from the get-go, we're trying to tweak things to get you into a cruising altitude where you can sustainably improve without falling apart. So I think what you said about the algorithm's brilliant. I thought that, okay, let's say we're not quite at quantum computers, running your genome through a simulation, spitting out a billion run throughs of what training stress looks like for you and your body. That sounds like science fiction, but AI was science fiction like 5 minutes ago. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually do see something like that in our lifetimes. But let's say we're shy of that, taking all the data we can and finding a way to crunch it the way Google does with the way that they are able to crunch immense amount of data to know things about you, having never met you, just seeing what you search, just seeing what you buy on Amazon, being able which women are like menstruating based on what they bought at the grocery store last week, like the type of predictive stuff they can do based off your habits, absolutely insane. So it stands to reason if you had a sufficient amount of data that was somewhat reliable based on how a lot of people track their training over a long period of time, I could see an algorithm that gets better at navigating that flow. I think one of the jumps that the field has to make is to get away from the discussion about optimal as being one single variable that you have a range and that you set it and it's fixed. That always stood out to me too. Strength training is always based around the direction of time. If you're talking about strength training, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, it's always a cycle. It's always a wave. It's always a block. It's always you're doing this now, but you have to vary things throughout the week or throughout the block, or you have to hit a crescendo and then deload. There's all kinds of things you have to do. Whereas hypertrophy, it kind of always feels like it's well, optimal is it's what you do now. It's the workout. The workout gives you, if you work out 50 times this year, this is 1/50th of your gains. And it doesn't work out that way. So as this type of data can contribute to people making decisions in real time about what they should do next, I could see that potentially having a lot of value. I'm a little bit skeptical on how that data would be collected. I could see if a sufficient number of people were actually logging in reliably to like apps that exist. You might be able to get something like that, but of course there's a lot of uncertainty there because people are very unreliable narrators in their own life. But I think there's good work that can potentially be done. I'm not entirely sure if it will. I would like to be hopeful and think that it could be. I would like in 40 years to look back and see people punching into some system like everything they did over the last 8 weeks, said, okay, based off how you've progressed over the last 5 years, we know that you're due for this, 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 and this. I agree with you about things not converging. You said that in the beginning. I asked that question because I was stress testing if they think about what the end result is. Because a lot of times when they talk about what's optimal, they talk about it as if we're going to find these valuables and it is going to converge. And there seemed to be a little bit of it was like that type of questioning hadn't been engaged with a lot about what does the end look like? What's the best we could possibly do? And then what are the limitations that are keeping us from there? I agree with you. I think it's going to be very individual. I think the best that we can do is being able to look at an individual, take everything we know as granularly as possible and be able to use that to predict how these changes in training over time should go off. And whatever your limitation is, you go down to the smallest thing that's keeping you down. Maybe it's durability. With me, it's durability. I fall apart like super easily. Everything else has to get informed by that. Maybe for somebody else, it's their leverages. Maybe it's psychology. There's a whole bunch of things that might fix your training. And each one seems to me is going to have its own like constellation of variables that would be just right for an individual based on who they are. And how close to that, I'm not entirely sure. But I am sensitive when, because I think about these thought experiments a lot. Where could this potentially go? You listen to theoretical physicists talk about what pushing the field forward looks like. It's entirely discussion about how precise is our measurements, what technology is limiting us, what other invention has to allow us to smash particles together more so we can break past that point and push the darkness back a little bit. And I almost never hear that in this field. I actually have to kind of give a shout out. Like Greg Knuckles was on the Data Driven Strength podcast so many weeks back, and they had a long run where they were kind of engaging with that type of hypothetical of this is what's limited. This is what we don't know. These are the things that kind of get ignored. If we can find this, this, or this, and then they were theorizing about where that might take the field. It was very refreshing to hear that. So where all this ends up in the future, I have no idea. But I have the easiest job in the world, which is being a critic. So I don't have to build anything myself. I just have to wag my finger and be like, you're doing it wrong.
I think optimal is one of the most butchered and misused words right now. And that's kind of been like a hill I've been committing to dying on is that like the only way that we can improve like our communication and understanding is like words have to have meaning, right? If we can't agree on the common definition of words, that basically we're just everything's just going to break down from that point in time, right? And like I think optimal has become synonymous with ideal. So like ideal basically is like in a perfect world, this is what it would be, right? Where is optimal is meant to have we have to be able to remove context to talk about things principally, right? That just has to happen because I can't only talk about things for a specific individual. I have to be able to say, okay, if I'm talking about, all right, what is the best exercise or the most optimal way to train the lats in a lengthened position? I have to be able to talk about the principles that are going to be somewhat unanimous going through there. But in the real world, once you put in the individual context, optimal now includes, well, what do you have access to? What's your ability to actually execute this exercise from a skill standpoint, et cetera? Do you have access to better equipment, but it takes 20 more minutes of your time to drive there? All of those things, like all relevant context of pros and cons go into what's optimal for a person. And so I think there has been, like, people have started removing the discernment between when we're talking about something as a principle and we're talking about something as a concept. And we can be like, oh, yeah, okay, this here is how we would do this in principle. And we use the word optimal there. But then as soon as we have an individual, optimal is flexible to the new context, whereas ideal is not, right? So it's okay. The ideal way to get across town is just like a straight line straight there. Okay. Optimal takes in the context of, well, there's buildings in the way and there's traffic, and well, this is more a more scenic route. This one goes by the coffee shop, et cetera. So like your optimal route to get somewhere, right, in training or otherwise, is going to be very individual dependent. That doesn't mean that the physiological principles aren't still important. They just might not be the most important, right? Because if we treat optimal as ideal, then whenever we talk about what's the optimal exercise, well, that means that everybody has to go get the absolute best piece of equipment. And theoretically, we may not even have that. It may not even be something that exists right now, or it might be one of the things that exists in my gym only because it's the only one in the world. So I think that the discussion around optimal and its misuse, or it's like the failure to say, hey, this is we're talking about this is principally right, but for you, optimal is relevant to your individual context. Your everything from your anatomy to every lifestyle or practicality objection that you could have. Right.
Yeah, when I was talking to Pac and Milo, and it was towards the end, and I wish we had done this earlier, start giving like concrete examples. But he was asking me about some variable, trying to show that the research shows this. So he was saying like, okay, you pick somebody out of a crowd, you don't know anything about them. Are you more likely to have them do this or that? Basically saying, hey, this is what the research shows, that this is probably more likely to work. You're probably more likely to have them do this. Therefore, you're following the science. That's kind of what it is. And when I heard that, I was like, well, that's kind of the first honest discussion about what optimal means, or the first honest example about what optimal means, because it's given the things you don't know, given that we're now on the level of what that particular research studied. Yeah, if I don't have any information about you, if we don't know anything else about you, it's this crapshoot of, given a complete lack of information, what are you going to default to? And that's about the limit. When people hear optimal, they are not conceptualizing, given all these question marks, what's likely to yield a marginally greater return. They hear, this is what all of my progress hinges on. That's in real terms, that's what it means to them. To the point, I interviewed, I don't know if you know him, Atlas Power Shrugged, who does a lot of odd lifts. He's shirtless in jeans in his parking lot. But he's a real smart guy, and he had a lot to say about this. But I interviewed him, and he was going off about, it was a study that Menno put up on his Facebook about sleep. And it was just kind of showing, like, hey, here's another nail in the coffin for, I don't know, sleep being important. But it was like, the study had 10 subjects in it. It was like, it was not a great study. But then you see in the comments how people interpret it, where people are like getting black pilled because they think optimal sleep, or sleep being optimal for growth, means that if they're not getting sleep, what's the point? So you have people in the comments where their perception of optimal is that, oh my God, I'm in this run. I have a newborn. Like, I have a newborn. If I look glossy eyed, it's not because I'm drunk. This is like sleep induced, sleep deprivation induced delirium. But if, let's say you do have a newborn, let's say you work a crazy job as like a first responder or something, and you're like, wow, this run, I just shouldn't train because what's the point? My sleep isn't optimal. And they're not conceptualizing it as this marginal difference in outcome, to where if you can't focus on that, there's still this sea of the sea of things that you can do that is going to leave you better off than when you started. So it makes perfect the enemy of good, which is unfortunate because the perfect doesn't even exist to begin with. And then when you consider all the variables, I mean, you spend enough time in this field, you take for granted like how much you kind of intuit just through pattern recognition. If you were to like count all the things you keep track of with clients, I'm sure like you would be able to count dozens, if not hundreds of relevant variables for what actually might impact somebody's training. How many can anybody focus on at one time? And we end up getting influence again. It's a recency effect. It's the last thing we heard that we think is the most important because we're like, oh my God, I'm not doing that. My training isn't optimal. The analogy I give, it's if somebody wants to start doing triathlons and they hear that, you know, it's optimal to be very aerodynamic. So you don't know how to swim, you don't own a bike, but you go to the store and buy some razors to shave your legs. The actual contribution of that thing that you're so fixated on, not only is it minimal compared to what you might anticipate, but it's actively the thing that will prevent you from doing anything if you let it derail you. So yeah, I don't know what the term optimal is supposed to mean. I don't know. I always interpreted it as, yeah, this is the thing that's going to get you the best gains. But that is such a complex, multifaceted question that changes for each individual and for each individual changes over time. I don't know why the word gets used so much other than people like to hear it.
It's interesting that you bring up the binary thing where people think it's either optimal gives results or not optimal gives no results, right? And yeah, I think people have lost the plot with the difference between something being effective versus, okay, what one this one is the most effective, and realizing that the gap between effective and nothing is huge, and the gap between effective and most effective is small, right? Like you could make a program to play on like the current trend of talking about long muscle lengths. Like you could create a program that was nothing but short muscle length training, right? And it would still be effective,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
You know, it's not by all means what I'm recommending that the approach that you take, but it just goes to show that, okay, you could still make decent results, especially, okay, maybe that means you have to work a little harder or do a little bit more volume. There's so much that we have to eke out on this topic, but to assume that just because the exercise isn't on this, okay, it's not the best solution, that anything below that gives no results. I think, yeah, that is a huge mistake. And if people are making that assumption on scale, that's extremely unfortunate.
Yeah. And the other thing actually happens as well, where when people think this one variable is optimal, they also think that will carry them through most of the progress that they make because they engage with that one thing. Because I can focus on this because this is what is going to do all of this stuff. When of course it isn't. It's how it plays with everything else. When I think about research and think about where it would be going forward, like how would I do it if I was a trillionaire and I could run this stuff however I wanted? I think of like how each variable exists kind of connected to all the other variables around it. And that changes how people experience it. And to the point about doing something suboptimal, like the short muscle lengths, I always wonder like how important is this one optimal variable that by itself it would stand alone and do well if I had the ability to do the best possible version of this suboptimal thing. Like if I could handicap myself with I can't do anything but short muscle lengths, I can't do anything but 5 RIR, what could I potentially put together that would still not only provide some result, but actually be pretty damn effective? And that's what I always think of when I'm dealing with things on the complexity of programs, because I want to know what kind of the best or like most secure iteration of this principle is compared to this one, which means, okay, commit to the thing you think is suboptimal, but how the hell can I flesh it out so that it's still a juggernaut of a program? And I think people have a lot of play in the joints when it comes to that. I've experienced that with my handicaps. If I'm injured, like I can't strain on a lot of movements. So I had to find ways to work around it. I couldn't handle certain frequencies. I mean, frequency is great for strength, for getting practice touches in. And I find that if I, squat or deadlift more than once every 8 days, I'd fall apart. Well, that's a handicap. That's not ideal. But you can find workarounds that are not only good enough, they're actually so good that you can still continuously progress, answer that question of what comes next. And it's not like it's a different type of hypertrophy you get by doing the optimal thing. It's just how much of those gains can you stack forward over time. So as long as you're making forward momentum without stalling, without going through long plateaus, without getting lost in disillusion and thinking like, shit, I'm going to go find another hobby. As long as you can keep inching forward, you're ahead of just about everybody else.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you touched on it there briefly when you mentioned, well, that's not ideal. And then you were taking this other approach. That's where I see the separation of optimal ideal, right? Ideal is if you had no limitations, then this would be the thing. Optimal is giving your limitations. What's the best that I could do? Like that's what it means for you contextually, right?
Sure.
Now, if we remove all the context, optimal ideal will be the same thing because there's no limitation. But in the real world, we're working with real people, right? With real limitations, right? And that's where it's tough sometimes for us to have a conversation about the principles because we have to kind of, we can't, all right, we're going to just sit here and talk about how this relates to every human on earth. So we're going to go through the whatever 8 billion iterations of this principles. No, okay, we have to talk about if we remove limitations, how do these exercises compare? But then when you throw the person in, then you have to take in that context or same thing with training volume or whatever it may be. Cool. We can talk about these things principally. And that's what feeds into the algorithm with the individual data at the same time.
Absolutely.
So when it comes to individualizing things, right? So your background is mostly on the strength side of things, right? And I think obviously the more sport specific, the more constraints there are, right? Which tends to kind of like narrow things down. When we get to hypertrophy, that's probably the most like broad in terms of the options and the levers that you have to pull. You just have more options than anything else, right? So the ways that you can go about it, because there isn't a performance element of them, just gives you, it just opens up the possible variations so much. And
Mm.
not just the overall possibilities, but also the possibilities of what may actually be effective for an individual, right? Where it's just, okay, when there's a performance goal, there's just going to be certain things that you have to stay in line. So I think there's the most flexibility with hypertrophy, which I think that's important context also when Milo and Pack first looked at your video, their niche is the hypertrophy world, right? And so they were kind of looking at it through that lens and you're coming from the strength world. And so I can see how there would be just a slight shift in one direction or the other in terms of how much you're leveraging more of like research data and stuff from there versus more the field data. When you have that skill component to be like, there's far, we'll say, less physiologically relevant things when it comes to strength and sport things because you have those constraints. But then when we remove those from hypertrophy, then all of a sudden now, because like the possibilities of variation open up even more, then anything that can help kind of narrow down the number of choices or options I have becomes, I would say, more valuable. And one of the things that I try and teach coaches in terms of program design is like when you first start off, the best thing that you can do is start eliminating things so that your decision process just becomes easier and easier and easier, right? So if you're having to decide between 20 different things, if you can take in that individual context, or if we can pull from what we know from research and physiology, et cetera, and all of a sudden reduce that to 4 things, then that's a much, much easier way to make decisions as a coach. And also then your trial and error process becomes much, much smaller. So I think one of the reasons that I think science is very, very popular in the hypertrophy sphere is just because not only is there so many variations, but I also think that the, the tracking or the measurement of your N of one experience is more difficult when it comes to hypertrophy because it's just simply a harder metric to track, right? It's strength is so much easier to track. And same thing for performance and okay, there's techniques and whatnot. And we can like in certain elements, we can rely a lot more on the physics. Like you were talking about, okay, cool. You're just looking at people's leverages and whatnot. And we can like, okay, well, if I'm looking at somebody and okay, they want a big chest and I could be like, okay, I can understand your leverages and that might help how I do individual exercises with you, et cetera, and stuff like that. But man, there's so many questions that I can't answer as well with that because it doesn't actually matter if I make you a better bench presser or not in this instance. I'm curious looking at the individual approach outside of the measurements and stuff, what are the things that you use to be able to kind of progress an individual? We talked about, oh, there's a million things that we can track, but are there things that you tend to lean on, or are there categories that you lean on? And I know hypertrophy isn't your realm, but since that was kind of where the, we'll say, critique came from, if you want to throw anything in there specific to hypertrophy, that'd be good.
Sure. Yeah. You mean what variables I focus on when I'm progressing clients in training?
Yeah, like how do you know that, okay, this is working or
Sure.
this is not working, right? I mean, how do we refine the algorithm within the coaching process?
Sure. So everything again, because it is constrained usually by competitive blocks. And even when people aren't competing, when there's I'm still having them in that kind of framework because it is just convenient to get comfortable looking at things in those kind of smaller units, getting more insight into how long it takes fatigue to build up, how many weeks in a row you can do competitive movements before burning out. That's all valuable information to have. And assuming it's just as good for getting strong year round as doing anything else, it makes sense to kind of kill two birds with one stone. So, getting into that framework, you have a lot of flexibility if things are not going the way you want them to, because you get through the block. Maybe you deload, maybe you feel recovered. You begin the next one with educated guesses. I would focus a lot on movement selection. Again, because strongman, it's like how an individual is built. They're either going to be built very well for certain things, which means they're built very poorly for other things, or some people are kind of in the middle. And I would focus a lot on exercise selection just based on how I anticipated they would need to be reinforced to kind of make up gaps in their physique, because as much as I like just grabbing a barbell and doing some work and just watching yourself grow as you progress the numbers, that's a guaranteed way long term to leave like plenty of chinks in your armor. So it's very heavy on movement selection. That would be one of the things I would rotate based on need. You find something that seems to carry over, it works well, we're inclined to leave it in more. Then I would have other ones that would get more heavy as we get almost like a circa max phase for certain events that were better for overload. And really, it was just a matter of the biggest thing was recovery. I'd look at recovery before I would look at somebody actually getting strong, because it's not that difficult to get a productive growth stimulus. Like, it's really not that hard. Even if you have somebody who's relatively advanced, even if you have somebody who's been at it for a while, who's kind of stuck, I mean, novelty is a really powerful thing that not enough people probably leverage or don't leverage the right way. And it's tricky. It's not always as predictable as you'd want it to be. But a new stimulus or finding creative ways to increase the stimulus that doesn't tank the recovery more, that was always going to be the key. So I would look for weight going up on the working sets over time, week to week, block to block. I was always a big fan of avoiding strain. That's my bias. Is getting under a shit ton of weight and straining a great way to get strong? Absolutely. It also has a huge cost. It's also less predictable. Some people can tolerate it better. Some people are going to feel like shit eventually, and you have to do a whole bunch of other things to keep them in one piece. And given the number of things we had to juggle, if I can just have you do work and just look at the math and say, okay, the numbers under the hood, we know those are going up. So over week to week, we know there's an increasing stimulus. And as long as you're eating and you don't feel like shit, you're not run down, we can predict pretty well at the end of this, you're going to feel a little bit better, perform a little bit better. Not growing, or let's say taking steps backwards. You go in, you feel really good. You come in over the next couple of weeks, you have a shitty workout. Okay, frequency might be too high. You might have been pushing too hard on movements you should have been taking it easy on. We might be having movements that really work against your leverage advantage, or sorry, your leverage setup the way it exists. And those might be causing more stress for you than maybe it does for somebody else. So it's constantly guessing, second guessing, and trying to make what seems like logical movements. The kind of rep ranges we stay in would be pretty similar. It'd be varied. So those were always easy to tweak and manipulate. It really came down to frequency, effort, and exercise selection. And if I could pinpoint recovery, that would almost always correlate with somebody doing better on the other side where they were stuck. So that was always just the first order thing that I would focus on.
All right. So your three main levers were frequency, effort, exercise selection that you like. And so, and your kind of your gauge of whether or not you calibrated those appropriately was the fatigue cost. Like that
Yes.
was kind of like, so basically it's like you want to see progression without hitting a certain threshold of fatigue cost. And you're basically looking at the decision making process of I have these three levers to pull on. So then, and this is, I mean, this is where it's tough because we can't just pull your brain out like an Iron Man and look at it like a map or whatever. We can't give you like, we can't look at you like we can look at Jarvis. Just see, and each coach kind of has basically that's what you kind of have is you have everything, experience, whatever, and you're looking at these things in real time. And if we were to try and test this with a AI, that's the same thing that it would be doing, right? Just probably on a much larger scale than what we're capable of. So knowing that you have like those three levers, right? Are there any insights that you can give me in terms of like how you would, decide between the three when the outcome was not what you wanted, right? Is what is taking off in your brain to say, okay, it's probably exercise or it's probably the frequency or it's
Ah,
probably the effort, right? Because those are the questions where this lets us know kind of how your algorithm works.
sure. Sure. I mean, to do that, I kind of have to run through a specific example in my head because it depends on one of any number of things that I see when I watch them lift, when I see them come in, when I know how their warm ups go and how they're moving and how their energy is. And it depends on what I witness from their working set. So, I mean, let's say effort. I would be inclined to manipulate effort if I think here's a good example. There's a type of deadlifter who is very explosive, who yanks the bar any which way above the knees. And then everything above the knees looks like molasses. It looks like they have like tripled bands over the bar, right? There's another type of deadlifter who is like a crane and moves painstakingly slow, inch by inch through the entire rep for multiple reps on end. I've known a few people like that. Does that come down to leverages? Does that come down to tendon insertion? Does that come down to, I don't know, willpower, the willingness to die under the bar, twitch? I have no idea. But those are kind of two broad types. And of course, there's other types based on a whole bunch of things. So let's say I see somebody who is doing their work, and let's say I prescribe something that's relatively intense. Hey, you're going to kind of work today. Well, if I recognize that this person is a grinder and the 6 reps before their last rep all moved at 3 seconds per rep, then it's okay. Well, you're accumulating a lot of very high tension, very long duration repetitions with a very systemically draining movement. Maybe for you, I'm not going to have you go to right up against failure on an AMRAP, or maybe I'm not going to have you really keep the RPE all the way at a 10 on a certain set. Maybe I'm going to give you more room to work with. Let's say we're working volume on that particular block. Then we can accumulate more work, get more practice in. I have more predictability over it. We can manipulate the variables that way because I have an anticipation that the cost is going to be much higher. And again, that's of course an educated guess. We plug it in, we see how it goes. So really, I'm looking at, I mean, I have a pretty good idea when I see how lifters are built, if they're lopsided one way or the other. Of course, not everybody is. And then aside from that, they'll have their own individual strengths that may play into that or play against it. But it's really not until I see them lift where I have an idea of, okay, your efforts wonk. Some people don't work fucking hard enough. And I'm like, screw the program. I need to teach you how to send it on a lift before we can do anything worthwhile. The program doesn't even matter until you know how to just, get yourself tuned up and go crazy. Volume is a hard one with strongman to engage with. I love volume for hypertrophy. I've used that in my blocks. I use a lot more volume for myself than I usually program for other people, mainly because strength guys are lazy. My universal experience is overwhelmingly if you program anything that looks like bodybuilding work for people that are super eager to get into powerlifting or strongman. A lot of them, they provide a lot of resistance. They don't take it seriously. And it goes back to what's the point of the high minded programming if I can't get somebody to do a set of front raises with effort or a set of skull crushers without it's so that's another thing that's very common. And it's okay, well, you're not going to push the gas here, which is the easiest thing you can do to guarantee you're going to get something out of this. So I have to, on the other end, make sure you do more work. So if you half-ass it, at least you did more half-assed work. And everything is just this constant seesawing of variables that are tethered together based on what I think they are or aren't doing. And you cross your fingers and hope that it works out the way you think it did.
Good.
Mm.
A slight tangent on the last thing that you said, because one thing I liked from Charles Poliquin in my years of learning from him was like the concept of the predictor lifts. Now, I don't think the accuracy was great because again, the individual variance or whatnot, but the concept of, okay, if you get this accessory motion up to this amount, then it will support you in your main lift to whatever amount, right? Now, again, accuracy probably not there. I mean, are there some trends? Yes, where it's okay, cool. If we have strength in this movement pattern, it's probably going to carry over, etc. But I do think that, like, from an actual in practice, that was probably a very good way of getting people to actually be motivated to improve those other lifts when there was an instilled direct correlation of, so you could be like, okay, yeah, all right, this person is not motivated to do a set of front raises. But if all of a sudden they understood, hey, right now, the way this is set up, if we get your front raises, we need to get your front raises to this if we're going to be able to push your other lift to that.
Mm.
Maybe then, okay, cool. That is it that the predictor lift is, oh, it's because because they front raised X amount of percentage of this, they could therefore the incline press. Yeah. But if the outcome is that understanding that correlation and making it somewhat tangible got the lifter to then implement the appropriate effort and consistency into those things, that then did the outcome come from the process or because they got their front delt raised to the
Yeah.
exact percentage that it needed to be or whatever, right? Like, I think it's much more likely the former. But I just thought that was one of the things where it's okay, in terms of training strength people and stuff like that, I just saw a tremendous amount of utility in that, even though that, like, from a scientific accuracy standpoint, I'm like, yeah, okay, not everybody that can externally rotate whatever amount is going to be able to then incline press 80 or 800% of that or whatever the heck the equation happened to be back in the day. But I bet a lot of people improved their lifts through the process of associating performance in one lift with the other, and it helped them overcome that mental hurdle, right?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I don't want to be like, oh, well, I've done that. I want to say there were one or two times where I've been trying to like get into somebody's head, like you have to take this seriously because the specific approach we're taking right now requires this to happen for you to get to where you want to go. Unless we ditch this and do another approach that forgets this because we're not getting anything out of it. And I've tried to correlate, like, hey, the next benchmark you hit, you're not going to get there unless this thing comes up. Or thinking about it, hey, the more you drill this, the more you're going to see that direct carryover. I tell this story and I hate to embarrass them because I love them. One of them is my wife. The other is a very good friend of mine, Emily Elliott, who is a professional strong woman who I coach. She's a good friend of ours. They both were part of the generation of lifters over the last, I don't know, 15 years, probably since CrossFit got everybody into the barbell, where instead of finding a way to a health club and then eventually kind of finding lifting on the back end of it, they started with a barbell. So then everything you know about how to grow, how to engage workouts is based around implements. And same thing with strongman. So you're used to these really big, heavy implements. So these girls, like they were both squatting over 300 pounds. They were both deadlifting 400 pounds, under 140 pounds body weight, and completely strong, completely used to just dying. You put them on a Conan's wheel or something where they're just leaning back and going until they collapse. Like the pain tolerance is through the roof. And I prescribed, like, it was an off block, like way far out from a contest. So I was trying to do a lot of things that didn't have a lot of spinal loading. So I think I prescribed like unilateral work and like leg presses. And I caught him on the leg press with 25-pound plates on the side. And It was just one of those things, like, I have seen you die. Like, I have seen your soul leave your body as you fought to lock out, like, the last rep of a 375 deadlift for reps. And then it's funny, you do the leg press. If you can walk upstairs, you can leg press 50 pounds on the leg press. But it just goes to show, and I'm the same way. I can't even talk shit about other people because I get set in my ways, what I've done over and over and over. So building the bridge of what you need to do and building those associations, and then that unlocks a whole other dimension of training that is insanely relevant as long as our brains are driving our bodies, of how seriously we take it, how hard we work, what is our association? Are we going after this thing like we're getting a paycheck for it? Are we doing it because, as far as we're concerned, it's a hobby and we get to get online and tell people that we lift weights and it's really cool? I have a hard time changing my associations when I change blocks because I do a lot of varied types of training. Sometimes I like spending 2.5, 3 hours doing a bunch of isolation work, and sometimes not. And being able to keep in your mind exactly why it is that you're doing what you're doing. You have to feel it in your bones why you're doing what you're doing, or else there's going to be just a lot of wasted energy that would be better spent recovering.
So the last aspect I want to go through with this science versus not science discussion is a little bit on away from the technical and more towards the cultural, right? I think the solution on the technical side, this is my opinions, is that we just need more transparency from the academic community and more accountability on that end. And then I think that the communication just needs to overall be better. My issue is not with the science as much as it's with the communication of it. But then we look at the cultural aspect of what's happening on social media, and that's a whole different thing where I think that I bet not as many people are anti-science in the sense that they have these critiques of it for the same reasons that you and I do. And a lot of them, it's because you insulted my favorite bodybuilder, or you took a shot at my favorite training methodology, or whatever it may be. And I have a few ideas of like, all right, what could each kind of side of this argument take to kind of be a little bit more constructive? I'll throw a couple out there. I don't want to like, I'll give all of my thing and then whatever's left that you could think of, right? But I think one of them is this trend of taking the most recent findings from a study and treating it like a discovery, right? Like what it's portrayed by these is, oh, hey, look what we discovered, rather than actually assign, because you have to be able to assign credit and blame appropriately. So I think that a lot of times something will be studied that, all right, this is the methodology that's been used in the field forever, but all of a sudden it will follow under the window of now science has ownership of this because we did a research study. And I think that certain people become very offended because there's not the credit or the respect paid to the field, right? And then conversely, I think that there's not a good job of everybody's, well, yeah, science, gets us closer to the truth or whatever. But there are plenty of examples where, okay, science got us off like a wrong path, right? So people like to like blame, oh, it's only bro ideas that were wrong and science is always moving closer to the truth. And I'm like, oh, especially when we look at mechanistic data, there have been so many times where it's, oh, a study was done and then all of a sudden squatting is bad for your knees. That came from science, right? Insulin makes you fat, right? Okay, where does that come from, right? That wasn't some bro wasn't like, well, I bet the reason that, it's not calories and whatever, it's insulin, like the whole insulin theory. Again, like there's been plenty of, we'll say, poor ideas or poor approaches that have their roots in science that at that point was either incomplete or poorly interpreted, et cetera. And there, I don't think that there's a lot of accountability for those things and look back and, okay, cool. Because it's cool to be like, all right, cool, we're self-correcting here. And I think we're saying that a lot in exercise science right now, is a lot of course corrections. And I think people, they have such a short memory that they don't realize that, oh, okay, there were things said about volume, train to failure, rest intervals or whatnot. And if you just go back in time, you're going to see that the scientific consensus on these things, like bounces around, and there's some convergence. It's not converging to a single point over time, but it wasn't too long ago that, man, almost all of the people in the evidence-based space were like frequency, 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 like frequency is the number one thing. And then now you barely hear, now it's, oh, frequency is just a way of distributing volume. So as long as we get the volume, probably, not such a big deal. Like, so I think that accountability on those things is good. So accepting some of the blames where, yeah,
Sure.
science did kind of get it wrong. And also not being afraid to pay some credit to the field when it's, look, okay, you can say whatever you want. These people got lucky, right? They still got lucky, right? But I would say there are plenty of examples in the field where they're batting over 50% in terms of getting lucky. There are coaches that have been getting a lot of things right. But I mean, obviously, like when you're moving beyond where we have data, you are going to get things wrong, right? And I mean, if you don't occasionally get things wrong as a coach, then you probably aren't ever trying to push the envelope with anybody. You're probably taking a very conservative approach. So to expect that, oh, well, he got this right, but because this person did this other thing wrong, they therefore don't deserve credit for what they got right. So I think that is where some of the animosity towards the academic community comes from, more of the bro community and the historian community. And so I think from a scientific perspective, if there could be a little bit more, we'll say, respect given to the field and a little bit more accountability. And then from the opposite side, right, I think acknowledgement of how much of what we consider common knowledge has also been influenced by science, especially if we have the appropriate expectation of what we should be getting from science. If you're expecting science to tell you that you need to do exactly this many sets at exactly this RIR, and that's the magic recipe for hypertrophy, then yeah, you don't understand like where we're at all with what we should be taking from the current research. But if you understand that, man, a lot of the people, the way they have evolved, their exercise selection, the way that they have started looking at things or whatnot is a combination, especially of those foundational sciences, right? I mean, pretty much everything, like every exercise that we do comes from biomechanics,
Oh,
right? Like,
sure, sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, and physics, right? So it's okay, cool. Like every tool that we're using in the gym, every machine that you're getting on, right? Whether some of them better than others, for sure. But so I think to say that, okay, just because we can't get certainty from the latest volume study doesn't mean that, man, exercise science has contributed a ton. And I think you talked about, I think Jordan Peters in one of your things, right? And he got in, he was one of the figureheads, or one of the names that came up in this debate before you even got into it. There was a back and forth between Pac Milo and Jordan Peterson, because
Really?
or Jordan Peters, not Jordan Peterson.
Jordan
Uh,
Peters. Oh, yeah, yeah. I
Jordan
was
Peters.
like,
Oh, yeah. Ugh.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. They're the exact same person, right?
It's
Um, but Jordan, somebody asked him, one of Jordan's Q&As, hey, do you think exercise science has contributed anything relevant or whatever? And he was like, absolutely nothing. It's just a bunch of, nerds that don't lift and whatever. And I'm like, okay, I understand that that's a frustrated position, because yeah, there's probably people on his clients that I'm like, or in his comments that are like, oh, why aren't you doing this little one thing to do this one little variable? Because of what they're taking away from one of those optimal science-based posts or whatever, right? But at the same time, I know Jordan takes extremely scientific method-based approach. He logbooks like more detailed than like pretty much anybody. And to me, it's just, okay, you have to understand that like your approach to training is like you are applying the scientific method like more than the majority of people, right? And you can't take away how much the foundational scientists are helping you do that in your training. Like when we're talking about like, how do we manage fatigue? How do we manage progression? Like, how do we make adjustments in exercises and stuff like that? We're leveraging this. And then what hypotheses are we coming up with to figure out what to tweak? It's in the algorithm, whether you want it to be there or not. And so I think from the bro perspective or from the anti-science, it's being like, look, you're getting like science is for sure a net benefit, the net benefit, unless you are only taking in this, we'll say, I don't want to call it fringe content because it is fairly blatant, but if the only thing that you're taking and putting under the science umbrella is YouTube, TikTok things that are quote science based, and then yeah, cool. Then yeah, that's probably bad. But if we take it as a whole, almost every
Yes.
seasoned coach or whatnot is leveraging exercise science a ton. And so I think a mutual respect there will serve both communities. But go ahead.
I'm happy to grant you that. I think it does go back a little bit as to what do we mean like when we say the science. I mean, if we're just saying that any systematic approach of finding what works for us is science, then yeah, of course that's essential. And by the way, I would have always at any point given, like you said, the foundational sciences their due. I mean, I wouldn't know anything about leverage if I didn't take physics, right? Like I wouldn't know anything about biomechanics if I didn't take anatomy or take all the biology classes, if I couldn't actually conceptualize how things work the way they did and try to anticipate how each piece is being stressed in a complex physical system. I think that's incredibly relevant. And I think that's true. I think when people, and I don't know what Jordan Peters was thinking when he said that. I can't get in his head. I'm not going to speak for him, but I would guess that when people take that kind of those pencil neck dweebs don't lift, they don't know what they're doing. That sentiment, I believe, tends to be confined and directed towards, I think, the type of TikTok or YouTube personalities. I think the type of people that are quick to misrepresent, to miscommunicate. And I believe it's more specific to these types of studies that we're seeing that have to do with these individual variables in a vacuum that aren't connected to individual variants, that aren't connected to how they habituate over time, that aren't connected to other variables in a complex system. And then they just end up going out on a ledge. I'm, again, limitations of language. I'm happy to use other words, or I mean, maybe we can coin today another meme word that is a little more clear about what we're talking about. But I am like, it sounds bizarre to say because I'm here on the like exercise science is fucked up. I'm a science guy. Like I grew up reading Carl Sagan and Michio Kaku and Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould. Like these are things I have a lot of respect for. And I'm critical because I know what they can do if they're applied properly and with a measured approach. And especially I went through 1 year of kinesiology. I got through my prereqs and then went through a year of kinesiology specifically because I'm like, oh, I want to get a handle on this as my career, but also to get an edge on training for myself and other people. This is what I want to do. That's where I'm going to get the edge. I went in there with this view that, oh, this is something I can leverage to kind of inform what I'm doing and get a better handle on things. It didn't really turn out the way that I thought at that point, but I think there's plenty to give empiricism in what we do and what we know. I mean, even if you're an idiot bro and you just go to the gym, the machines you're using have all been rigged into the ground to use cams to change the strength curve and to try to put you in different positions to try to round everything out. You have bodybuilders that go hunting for that one Nautilus pullover machine that they really like because there's just nothing quite like it. And all of that's extremely relevant. So I'm happy to like be a little more specific when I'm being critical in the future because talk about the science being a shit show is admittedly open ended and not specific. Everything you said about the communicators or the academics getting due credit, but also kind of being to blame in the way they communicate. I mean, I agree with all of that. I think it's just, I'm happy to say it's not the problem with the science. And this is my response when people would say, oh, the field's in its infancy, it's still growing, it's still doing what it's supposed to be doing, and we're figuring out in real time. And I understand that there's no shortcut. You can't sidestep you can't sidestep the cluster of figuring it out before you figure it out. I really think it does come down to the relationship that incentivizes people to say that they figured it out before they figured it out. I don't know how you get around that. I feel like that exists in every field. As soon as that consumer dynamic exists, people are going to want to be like, here, this is what I put together based off the literature. I don't know how you sidestep that, but provided there could be some, you said accountability, there could be some checks and balances. There can be some finger wagging when people get a little kind of cringy with their ability to stand out on a ledge and proclaim that they can see through, that they can read the tea leaves and figure out exactly how all this fits together. I think we can get into a better spot as long as people are being held to the standard where they are responsible, not waiting for other people to be responsible for them, but they're responsible for communicating in a way that makes very clear what the boundaries of what they're saying are, so that it doesn't get misinterpreted and so that it doesn't black pill a whole generation of lifters who think that if they can't do perfect, what the hell's the point?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so much of this falls onto the science communicators. And I think the critique has to come, or I shouldn't say has to come, but I think it will land much better when it comes internally. Right? Like I
Oh, I
think,
think I think you're right.
you
Yeah,
know, I,
absolutely.
I think the more that it takes people outside of academia to like, because what tends to happen is somebody from the outside makes a criticism. And then if anybody else in academia is asked about it, they will softball it, go around it, etc. And I'm like, man, you guys need to be okay stepping on each other's toes,
So
right?
I will say, if I can interject, that is a big point that I wanted to make because I'm an outsider, right? For whatever, I don't have a PhD. Like, I spent a fair amount of time in college. I'm not the guy that people on the inside want criticizing their stuff because a knee jerk reaction, and maybe rightfully so, is who the hell are you? What have you done? But in digging into this stuff and listening to everybody else, and I'm not going to say that any of these guys believe in everything I've said, I'm not going to speak for them, but I took a lot of my perspective from people in the field. A lot of the things that were repeated by Brad Schoenfeld. A lot of the things like Greg Knuckles is very open about his criticisms. Eric Helms is very measured. I mean, he's saying the studies don't exist to inform you what to do on a Tuesday. I almost feel like that gap isn't being addressed within the field, that there is that kind of like you said, softball, there's that kind of I'm making my positions, but I'm not naming names and we're not kind of going to be overly confrontational. And I would like to see people checked. I mean, if anybody thinks any other person is stepping out of bounds, I think you're absolutely right. Like it has to come internally because if it comes from an idiot like me, the response is going to be like, what do you know? Like, we got it over here. Sit down. I really do believe there is kind of a gap fundamentally, and it's not going to get exposed unless people are asked, and somebody like you would probably be better at coming up with the specific line of questioning. But unless people are specifically asked around the boundaries of what they believe, of what the protocol should be about when it's an evidence-based recommendation and when it's just you offering your little biases based on what you like as a PhD. And I think if you did that, I think you would get people to kind of get a little combative, that there would be some disagreements about where that line is. I think in real terms, you see that expressed to a different standard from some people compared to others.
Mhm. Yeah. Lyle McDonald is a personality in the industry that is
Uh,
somewhat unique. Lyle has taken, he sends me hate mail occasionally, right? Right. Just randomly. I haven't got one in a while. And so I'm kind of like, I'm feeling a little neglected. So if you see this, Lyle, I mean, I am overdue. Uh, but I appreciate the strong critic to a degree. I mean, personal demeanor to my aside, it's okay. If nobody's going to do it, then the few people that are going to do it and they are going to go ham and they're not going to hold
yeah.
anything back. I'm like, okay, this is an essential thing to have right now. Is it the best way to happen? No, it should come internally, but when it does, I see the way that Lyle goes about that or whatever. And I'm not criticizing his critiques. I'm just saying he does not critique in a nice way. Right. And I don't think you're obligated to by any means, but I believe that that is a symptom of not enough internal critique. Right. And so I just use Lyle as an example, but there are plenty of people that do that. Right. Like I think the trend of reaction videos now is interesting, but like people are reacting to like celebrity workouts or they'll react to an influencer or whatever it may be or whatnot. Oh, let's break down this person's or whatnot. So I'm looking to kind of, I don't know, spark our social media a little bit. It's not a thing that I particularly like to do, but man, reaction videos are extremely low hanging fruit. And that's probably why people do that in combination that the algorithm absolutely loves them. But I'm like, I am not the type of person that I'm not going to pick on Mark Wahlberg's workout. I mean, that for my audience, that provides no value. Absolutely no value for me to sit here and, do that. But I'm like, maybe I will do reaction content exclusively. If anybody puts science based on a piece of content, then I will be like, that to me is an invitation to critique. So I think that's a direction I'm going in. Hope maybe that will spark some
That'd be
more
fantastic.
internal discussion, or maybe I will just be pushed even further away from that group. Like an interesting thing. We're going to wrap this up soon here, but an interesting thing that I discovered, like, is I decided that with the stuff that we're doing, they're like the foundational science level of so many of the, we'll say, the figureheads that we see on social media and the people communicating stuff is so poor that oftentimes it takes too much work to actually get them to the point where then you could have the conversation, like the actual debate, right? Like when it comes down to the topic like biomechanics or something like that, like when people just don't have an understanding of anatomy or physics well enough, it's you can't even have the discussion at that point in time, right? So that was a huge limiter in me being able to share some of the stuff that we were doing, and then having the evidence-based community being like, there's a paper for that or whatever. I'm like, okay, no, there's not a research paper for every exercise that exists. In fact, there's only a handful of exercises that we have direct research on. But we have to be able to look at things principally because we're not just going to limit ourselves to only the exercises that are in the research. But we can't have that principal discussion if you don't actually understand the foundations that are needed for that. And I think that's a limitation right now with the range of motion research or whatnot. Okay, to apply this stuff properly, you need to be able to understand the physics of an exercise. You need to understand a little bit of anatomy to know, okay, all right, if I want to get working a longer muscle length, to know how to move the body to get there. And then I have to know how to, like, what exercises or how I could actually load that appropriately. And what we're seeing is that people, like, so many people are like, oh, I'm doing length and partials, but they're doing it in like a place that makes absolutely like no sense if we were to like follow the principles. Yes, you are doing a length and partial, but this is probably a place where it wouldn't be beneficial. Or instead of like they're doing a length and partial next to an exercise that they could have done that would just have been a better exercise period, rather than just, it's just, okay, cool. If
Yeah.
your choice is to do a length and partial in the cable station, or there's a machine right next to you that has a lengthened bias resistance challenge, you should just walk over to the machine and use that, and not just because length and partials are cool, just to do the length and partial. And so I see, man, there, like, I'm at a point where I, there's a communication gap because there's such a lack of understanding of these foundational things. So I was like, all right, well, what I will do is I will make the effort to be able to speak in a language that maybe will transfer more to that community. So I was like, I'll get our own lab and I'll start. Okay, cool. We'll measure EMG, we'll measure forces, we'll measure muscle oxygenation and hemodynamics and stuff like that. But cool, I can provide now tangible data. See, look, this line higher than other line, therefore better. If that's what I need to do, because it's too much of a gap to get somebody up to the level of understanding to understand why this exercise might be more beneficial than that, because we have to get their anatomy and their mechanics up to be able to participate in that. And the response was relatively negative from the, we'll
Really?
say, evidence-based community. I got people like, oh, these people are just they're just doing garage labs or whatever. And the irony is the system I bought was so much better than what's in the majority of universities. And we spent so much time, 'cause I've always been like, with something like EMG, which is, it's not a perfect proxy for anything. And then there's so many ways that you can kind of like have bad experimental design. So I basically, for the first maybe 6 months, maybe even the first year that I had it, was basically just sitting here and showing like, how are all the ways that we could basically get bad data, right? And actually replicating some of these studies and showing like, well, if they didn't do this, this, this.
Mhm.
So the amount of effort I spent into figuring out, okay, what can and can we not discern from this? And what are all the limitations? Like I vetted that so much because I went into it being a critique of the technology in the first place. And as well, if I'm going to use this, I'm going to try and just absolutely tear it apart first. And then to then be like, okay, cool. Here's the thing. And the nice thing, like the system I got is video sync. So that means that you see the form and where the sensors are placed and everything. It's right there. Like
Wow.
there's no more transparency than you get to see the actual set with the live measurements right there. That's why I bought the system that did. I'm like, this is going to be great because nobody can be like, well, what did those look like? And you said it was failure. What did failure look like? And et cetera. I'm like, well, it's right there in the video. And that was arguably like, if I look at it as just like in terms of what it did for our business in terms of credibility, it was for sure a huge waste of time and money. Right now, has it helped me in terms of just doing internal research to make our product better? Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, we're constantly trying to audit what we're doing. But I did find it interesting that there was almost no respect paid to the effort that I made. Like, how many of these guys are going to spend $100,000 to challenge their own ideas, right? And then be able to provide, hey, you know what? There's no existing evidence. I could just sit on my hands and claim this, or I could actually like show an investment in here and be as transparent as possible. And I just thought it was interesting that it was like, no, 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 no. You stay where you belong.
You spent all this time trying to warm me up to the field, and then you finish with this, and now I'm right back where I started because you got all these problems. Like the one thing they say is funding. It's you talk about the limited problems of the studies or whatever, statistical power, lack of big enough groups. They talk, well, it's funding. It's of course fun. It's always going to be funding. Nobody's going to throw money at what you're doing. So it stands to reason that you need all the data you could get, and you should be making best friends with anybody who's willing to be your little advisor or to be your little lab monkey somewhere else to try and do something that's of value. But I mean, if we're talking about paying charity to like the field, I mean, and I'm not saying it's everybody in the field, but for there to be that sentiment, it's a little too much. We got it covered, which, okay, do you? And it's a little bit of turning your nose up at what has fundamentally driven forward human civilization up into the point where universities became like a standard of civilization, which is our ability to discover things through these garage experiments. Through you have somebody who's intelligent and can pick things apart and was motivated, willing to spend the money, willing to do the work. There's good information there. And I don't know. I look at the system and I'm like, if they had to put it together like their lives depended on it, I think of all the things they'd be able to clean up. And coordination is one of them. I feel like there's so much room for coordination. If you really are having limitations with research, why isn't every study done at university communicating? So you're having the same parameters, the same rep ranges, the same exercises, so you can analyze. Why is everybody doing their own thing? Why are random rep ranges being chosen? Or I'm going to replicate this, but I'm going to change the exercises, or I'm going to leave this. Anyways. I don't want to start this whole thing all over again, but I think there's so much good that is done just like that. In fact, I think most of what people are going to get out of training is going to be from that type of investigative mindset. And I think you're onto something. I think you have a good understanding of what, not that you need my approval, but I'm listening to you talk about biomechanics and fundamental sciences and how this plays in. And it's okay, of all the things we can actually control, what is going to make a substantive difference? And that's something you zeroed in on. It's okay, how does the movement position, how does the mechanics play in, as opposed to, am I doing 8 reps or 15? Am I doing twice a week or 3 times a week? Am I doing, not that that's not relevant, but you're turning those dials with less certainty. But anyways, I think it's really cool when people like you do the mad scientist thing. And I heard, did I hear right? You're building a machine, or maybe it was an old thing where maybe you built it already. You're talking about building like a leg extension machine that actually takes the quad through the full range of motion.
Yeah. Right now I currently have our leg extension pulled apart or whatever. Like I love tinkering with things. And so if you were to come into our gym, you would occasionally see some wood in replace, things. You're going to see welding and whatnot. But I mean, a hobby of mine has been like, improving machines, right? Like improving the tools that we have, whether that be actually directly consulting with like Prime or Atlantis on new machines, or just like the stuff that I have, just like, all right, cool. What can I, with my capabilities, do
Dang,
to alter this thing to make it a little bit better? So,
that sounds awful.
I mean, it's tedious, but I mean, like,
No, I just meant
I
the
enjoy the.
exercise.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's a love hate thing, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. We're
So,
all masochists.
yep. So I brought up the reaction to the lab thing, or to our lab, just to kind of point out that I do think a huge limitation in moving forward is the cultural aspect, because that was like the critique. None of the critiques I got were on my methodology. It was just like, hey, you're not in the group, right? So just
Yeah,
by default, what I was doing just didn't count or whatever, without even any look or care, right? Like the amount of like, it was not like what I was doing. Like if I did something, was not looked at the same scope of like, well, okay, over here, some grad student, they did an EMG study on whatever this, and okay, well, we did one here, right? And here you get a black and white PDF, and you have very limited methodology. Here you see exactly what happened. I think that steps to culturally converge groups will go a long way in moving this forward. Because I do know there are a lot of people like me that, man, I will donate to studies, but I'm also interested in, I'm very interested in moving the field of science forward, whether through my direct participation, whether through advocacy, or whether through financial contributions or whatnot. But if there's such a cultural or a classish divide, that's just going to discourage that. And I think that's also going to play out in how the information and stuff is communicated and contributed. So cool. Well, that was my last piece. There was just like, okay, is there any recommendation for how we bring this together? So thank you very much for your time. If you have anything else that you want to say on that, feel free to close it up. And then if there's anything that you want to say in terms of people just being able to where to find you, et cetera, all that stuff will be down there. But if there's something cool that's coming up or whatnot in particular that you want to mention, go ahead and.
It's all my information's just on my YouTube channel, Alexander Bromley. If you want to drop in and yell at me and tell me how I'm an anti-scientific heretic, please feel free. But no, I mean, I can't tie a bow on it any better than that.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the N1 Experience.